The primary means reason comes up with to create peace is to create a state, that is a government, a commonwealth. We need someone to rule, and unfortunately nature has not provided us with one. There's no queen bee by nature. Therefore we must create one arbitrarily. So no one deserves to rule, we just have to pick someone, and whoever we pick, they don't deserve to rule. They're not entitled to it. They're not owed the crown. That's not the basis or the reason for us to obey them or defer to them. Anyone we choose will not have any natural superiority or right over us, but we are going to give him absolute right over us, absolute authority over us, because someone has to. So we pick him, whoever he or she is, because someone has to rule. Someone has to be picked. That's the crucial thing when you create a government, because the primary reason for war in this state of nature is that we want peace, but we can't trust each other. Not that we're bloodthirsty or cruel by nature. So there's no real danger of worry or any reason to consider anyone's moral worth or character or ability as ruler. The point is that someone has the position. We have to just put a badge on someone, create a sheriff who can break this cycle of distrust. And he does that because now the ruler who's empowered will kill anyone who kills another. So I no longer want to kill this person who I see in the woods out of fear that he wants to kill me, and vice versa, because that would make him insane. And I don't assume that most people I see in the woods are going to be insane, because we're all living under a common recognized power, a power with everyone's right to do whatever he wishes to anyone. So the creation of government kills this self-sustaining cycle of distrust that would grow up in its void. When we pick a sovereign, we're leaving one person alone in the state of nature. He doesn't enter into civil society with us. The sovereign has no obligations in or out of society. We have no ties on him. He has no duties to us. And the laws of the sovereign are unconditional and arbitrary as well, but they are also always just, and therefore we should always obey them, even if they're bad laws or imprudent or favor some others over us. There is no other source or definition of justice for us to appeal to. So we designate one person to whom we transfer all our rights to everything. And anyone will do, because everyone's equal, and that person will now represent us. We become a people through him, through the unity of the sovereign, the natural unity of his body as an individual. So there's no natural collective identity or will apart from this common power and the fear of those living under it that binds individuals to their own good to live together peacefully. So what about the third cause of war? The vainglorious, the ambitious. This is the big problem that Hobbes' whole system is aimed at solving to some extent. The title, the Leviathan, is taken from the Bible. It's a reference that's made in the book of Job at 41:33 to 34. And there, God is responding to Job, who's complaining about his plight as a just man who is suffering. And God's reply is essentially, who are you to question me, a mere mortal human being that I created? This infinite power is mysterious beyond your abilities to comprehend. And God goes through many of his awesome creations on the earth to show Job just how small he is and give some sense of just how big God is in comparison, who created all these awesome things. So he names things like tornadoes and other natural forces, and then he gets to this creature of the deep and the sea, the Leviathan. And he says, behold, upon earth there is not his like, who is made without fear. He beholdeth all high things. He is a king over all the children of pride. The children of pride are the vainglorious. Those are the ones who have to be put in their place. It's overwhelming. One would simply drop their weapons if confronted with such a creature. And that's the sort of state that the modern world needs. We need some sort of Godzilla, Leviathan state. You have to put ambitious people in power and let them squash all the other ambitious people, so that he has no competitors for competition, so that there is no confusion or disorder, or that the people aren't led astray to disobey. So the sovereign dominates the ambitious, noble types who have some sense of pride or dignity in favor of the people. The Leviathan is someone or something, some entity that is able to overawe all men under it. And whoever we fear before and above all others, all else, that's what a sovereign is. And that's the sort of uncontested, absolute, unquestioned power Hobbes is talking about. So if the ambitious could see and behold this great Leviathan or Godzilla, they'd be reduced to their proper dimensions. They'd be humbled and put in their place. They'd be put in proportion to everyone else, that they're just another lone, fragile speck circling a big, empty void. So the Leviathan is a little bit like a scared straight program, where we scare you and show you horrible things in hopes of making you think rationally, giving up on some certain irrational bad predispositions to disobey. Hobbes is going to teach fear and truth. He's going to scare you straight. For the truth is that we should be afraid. We're all equally squashable, and we're only mere bodies, sacks of blood and meat with no natural refuge or sanction or mandate. The truth is there's a fundamental need of man to stay alive, and it's not easy to stay alive. You're not invulnerable. No one's got your back. It's an illusion. If you're rational, you should feel fear. You're a nobody in the big picture. You're a nobody in the big picture. So No more highfalutin nonsense and pretensions about dignity and obligation desert. These are all baseless. So Hobbes is writing in order to scare people, and he's doing this to wake them up for their own good, to show them how the walls of society are paper thin and nobody is looking out for us or holding it all together. This is reality therapy. Forget about all these ideas of freedom, glory, democracy, dignity, and nobility, and get real. Start living for the sake of safety, security, comfort, and commodious living in that order. Not for virtue, nobility, morality, honor, greatness, glory, or unrestrained, dangerous, delusion-based ambitions. Just stay alive and be grateful for any security on any terms. Grateful you're alive and can securely keep some stuff if you're so lucky to acquire anything. That's about the best you can hope for and do, and should be all we should expect. This is all there is. This is it. Liberalism doesn't insist on or expect much more than bodily welfare or safety or comfort for all or most people. At its core, according to its conception of the world, society, government can't be about anything more than that. Not successfully anyway. It's too much for any government to be able to take on, and it's not what we want a government to take on, and it would come at the expense of our liberty. And that means dealing with and living with and accepting this fact that Hobbes starts with, that we're naturally selfish. But in a successfully run Hobbesian commonwealth, it can be very easy to lose sight of this goal. This is one reason why Hobbes recommends that everyone be made to read the Leviathan, in order that everyone is reminded that there's nothing more important or of a higher priority than their bodily security and safety, not honor, pride, justice, holiness, conscience, family, law, or anything. Hobbes seeks to create a world of security where security becomes the focus of people's lives, and society consists of equals, of security-seeking shopkeepers, not noblemen or classes who live in delusions or according to virtue, conformists, lovers of the useful above the beautiful or noble. And we can see this transformation in Hobbes's discussion of the natural law. Everything is redefined in terms of self-preservation. He redefines virtue as being essentially the same as a rational fear, in a good sense, that which is useful for using others. Bourgeois self-interest, rightly understood. The only way for us to escape the state of nature is for us to have a common absolute power. And this is only possible if everyone else voluntarily lays down their own right, if everyone else lays down their own natural inborn right to everything, leaving just one person or one group still remaining in the state of nature, still free to do whatever they want, still with the right to do whatever they want. And the social contract is between ourselves. We all agree to obey this one person left in the state of nature and not each other. So it's not with him, but with ourselves. He's not obligated. He can't be obligated. That would take him out of the state of nature. He has the right to do anything he sees fit. And now on top of that, he has all of our power as well. We've sworn our allegiance to him. We've sworn our powers to him for the sake of our own security. Now, sovereign power has to be absolute power. That is, it has to be unchecked. There has to be no appeal above it. There's no way, no standard by which we could judge it or condemn it. And by definition, the sovereign has to be unchecked and indivisible. This is by definition because if the sovereign were checked, if his power, if his decision, if his actions could be appealed to some other power, then that power is automatically a higher power. It's more sovereign than sovereign. The sovereign isn't sovereign. And if that power's decision is final, then that power is the sovereign. At the end of the day, either someone has to have the final word and a decision has to be made and it has to stand as absolute and official for all, or no sovereign, and you're going to lapse back into the state of nature. So we need a government, which means we need rules and a ruler, and that means we need somewhere where the buck stops. Someone who takes final responsibility, has final say, final authority. And it's an authority over all of our actions and behavior and official spoken opinions. We're absolutely bound to obey, and disobedience is now injustice. And the sovereign's word is the only standard for justice. Now, as I said, it doesn't matter who we turn all this power over to. It doesn't matter who we designate as sovereign and choose to obey. The important point is that the entire decision is completely arbitrary. There is no good or natural reason to designate anyone in particular. And once a people realize this key fact, that politics by necessity boils down to imperfect judgment calls about what's best, at that point people will begin to turn to their own business and begin to mind their own business, and politics will become safer. And that's the whole aim of the modern project. People will begin to look at government as a mere tool, like a hammer or a saw. There's many types, types of hammers, but they all do the same basic function. And we can judge the hammers by their function, what they're supposed to do for us. In the same way, the government is an artifact that we make for ourselves for our own convenience and utility, and can judge it by our own uses and needs. That is, the purposes for which we made it. This is the sensible way of looking at government, not the more traditional sense of worshiping or wanting to die for the government. You wouldn't worship or die for a hammer, as good of a hammer as it may be. That would be foolish, and in the same way, that would be foolish to do so for a commonwealth. We like to think that it's only just to fight for countries that have good governments, governments that we approve of, but for Hobbes, that would be the same as fighting for a good hammer. All governments are better than no government. That's the important thing, is to have a government, to have an absolute sovereign power. As long as that power isn't questioned and the people look at it sensibly as being created by them for their purpose, the form it takes isn't very important. Now, what Hobbes wants is that there will be absolute hereditary monarchy. He thinks this is the best form of government, the form that is most conducive to peace and security. In principle, people in the state of nature, they could have made a democracy or an oligarchy or whatever they wanted, but there's no natural or moral reason to prefer one over the other. But the efficacy of monarchy is what makes it best for Hobbes, and he gives three basic reasons for its choice-worthiness. Monarchy gives a society stability, consistency over time, and regularity, certainty, familiarity, and continuity with the powers that be. We put generals in charge of armies and CEOs in charge of companies for many of the same reasons, for efficiency of command. Nobody appoints a committee in charge of anything that they want done right or want done right away. To those who see the danger of exploitation, oppression, and an unqualified, unconditioned, unchecked authority, to this Hobbes says all governments have this danger, no matter what form they take. But the problem is better dealt with or avoided or lessened in monarchy, because in order to have the greatest promotion of the common good, you want a form of government where the interests of the government and the interests of the people, the society as a whole, are closest to being the same. And with a hereditary monarchy, it's like a family farm or an estate. It's beyond question that everything is his. It's his domain, so he's going to take special care for it. The king will want the country to be in good shape for when he hands it down to his heir. One-man rule is efficient rule. Top-down rule is streamlined. It leaves little room for uncertainty or debate. So you don't need as large of a structure to support it. You won't need as big of a government, as unwieldy as a government. That's always going to be necessary to satisfy the lusts of the ruling group. If you have an overly indulgent king, at least you just have one of them and then he dies. But overindulgence in a parliament or a council, that can infect the group forever, long after the original members die off. With a monarchy, at least you have it down to the lust of one guy, so there's less looting and corruption overall. So Hobbes says you're not obligated to anyone unless you have consented to it. And then after laying out the logic of all this in his argument, he says, as an aside, oh, by the way, you already tacitly did this. Simply by living under the existing government, you've implicitly given your consent. By benefiting, by living here, being safe, and you have benefited by having your life preserved from everyone else this long. So you see, this is kind of a bulletproof argument, a sort of trap, that once you accept all of his basic premises about the purposes of society and the equality of men, then you've already accepted your own situation, your own society, your own sovereign's authority over you. This orientation, this way of thinking about government and politics, this has all tamed the world in a way that we're no longer quite aware or can even appreciate. That's how much we've been transformed, how much society itself has been transformed, even more so than its governments. People in an enlightened age, in the modern age, are more civil, more obedient, gentler. We, our parents, our grandparents, and their grandparents all are, compared to the generations, the centuries that grew up before us. And that's because we've all grown up in it, from it, in the midst of it. Now, of course, there doesn't seem to be any actual civilization that came about in quite the way that Hobbes describes in chapters 13 and 14. And he realizes this. Most civilizations have been founded through conquest. Now, in that case, the logic is all pretty much the same. It's all tacit consent. Even if you never get out a contract and lay out terms with anyone, the tacit bargain between the conquered people and the conqueror, that is, he will spare your life if you authorize all that he does. So this conqueror, who has demonstrated his power over your life, now takes the place of the state of nature, our conditions in which we're making our decision. Now, it is true we were absolutely obligated to our king or our sovereign power or our government that was ruling us or that was conquered by this conqueror up until this point, but that does not obligate us to keep resisting the conqueror or keep obeying the vanquished king. And that's because Hobbes says once the ability of the king to defend you is gone, so is your obligation to him. You are essentially back in the state of nature. Now you have a choice again. You can resist or you can submit, as long as the conqueror gives you that choice. He'll be your preserver or your destroyer. Hobbes' thought experiment, his social contract, merely crystallizes the logic behind this decision for us. For him, of course, it's an easy one. We should all submit and obey any power that does protect us. But the original reason, the logic for which we enter society, for which we obey, that never goes away. That condition always remains. Even our obligation to this absolute authority, the absolute authority over our lives, that's absolute, but our obedience, our obligation to that authority, that is conditional. If obeying that authority is to endanger us, all bets are off. Because again, that was the original reason anyone would obey. That's what Hobbes makes the basis of our obedience, our preservation. So if the king drafts us into the army, puts us in certain peril, and asks us to sacrifice ourselves for the crown, obedience is no longer conducive to my survival. The logic breaks down. I'm under no moral obligation. It would not be unjust for me to desert. Or if the king orders me to be executed for whatever reason, perhaps deserting, perhaps murder, the sovereign power is now a threat to my life. It's no longer my protector, and my obligation extends only as far as the sovereign's ability to protect me. That's why Hobbes says we take prisoners to the gallows in chains, because we presume they're within their right to preserve themselves by any means necessary. It wouldn't be unjust for them to disobey and run away. They're essentially in regard to us and the sovereign power that represents us back in the state of nature. So if obedience, Hobbes says, despoils me or the ends for which I contracted, then it can't be understood. Then I cannot be understood as willing it. If it's only inconvenient, though, if it doesn't endanger my life immediately or directly, I am fully obligated. So a Leviathan state necessitates a mass state, a mass society, which can sustain an all-volunteer army or hire out mercenaries. This sort of logic would not be able to be held in a smaller, more traditional, classical-style republic. Hobbes posits peace, stability, and security, the safety of our bodies, or the elimination of human suffering, especially bodily suffering, as the end of politics. But he thinks that to achieve this very simple, modest goal requires a revolution in our thinking. Hobbes has succeeded in revolutionizing politics. We do think in his terms, in terms of the state of nature, natural rights, popular sovereignty, representation, economics, GDP, especially as they were recast and reformulated and laid out by other thinkers like Locke. Because we've grown up in a world transformed by these doctrines, we don't really see all of the ramifications of this revolution. All governments that have existed in the past, before Hobbes, always had one foot in the state of nature. This is why all government heretofore has been defective, according to Hobbes, and why the world needs him to explain how it was defective and how to change it. We need a wholesale rethinking of politics. And this is something that recurs over and over again in modernity, is a revolution of thought and politics. The whole problem, according to moderns, is that society was based upon and directed toward larger philosophic and religious ideals and beliefs. It's not to unite people based on a shared understanding of virtue, for example. So society's always tried to bite off more than it could chew. That is, getting everyone to agree to the same answers about the fundamental, most important questions in life. For instance, how to live, what to live for. For Aristotle, a regime's legitimacy rests upon a shared definition of what the good life is, what a best life is, and how to live. This is what a community or a regime is for Aristotle. It's a shared understanding of the best way of life. A community that lacks that is not a political community. This old-fashioned approach has something natural to it, but that's precisely the problem, according to Hobbes. That's the fundamental flaw or defect in all commonwealths not founded upon his principles. It's hard to get people to agree completely on these things about what's best or most important in life, and ambitious people have always been able to appeal to commonly recognized standards and say, that authority doesn't know the truth, I know the truth, so follow me, do what I say instead. Now this conflict that Hobbes speaks of has, in his time, is mostly taken the form of church versus state. So in the past, before the Leviathan, political orders were based on something unseen, unclear, uncertain, difficult to understand, and easy to challenge. That is, a consensus about religious and metaphysical truths about the highest, most subtle things in life, the meaning of life, what we're here for, what we're to do. And hence, political order has always been founded on quicksand, uncertain, dubious, or contentious foundations. And that's why governments have always had one foot in the state of nature. Therefore, Hobbes regards humanity as having reached a very special time, because now he can teach us how to do politics right. He can demonstrate that government is an artifact. It's our creation, made to serve our ends, our needs. And like all artifacts, they're originally crude, and Hobbes can refine and make it work right by sanding down parts and putting it back together in a streamlined, more efficient manner. So Hobbes is trying to make political authority that is impervious to attack, immune to dissolution, insurrection, from any sort of attack or appeals to some sort of higher morality or the challenges of the religious ambitious. And he does this, first of all, by removing any inexact, disputable standards or principles from political discourse as either being nonsensical, unreal, or simply irrelevant to the business of the state. And we saw this in his epistemology, that he attacked ordinary moral opinion, about which no one is certain and everyone disagrees. So Hobbes wants exactness, precision in language and concepts, because where there is exactness, there's no room for disagreement and nobody will dispute. So secondly, he wants to remove all higher standards, laws, doctrines to which the ambitious might appeal or distract us with. And we saw in his doctrines of the state of nature, the social contract, natural right, sovereignty, that a primary purpose of all this was to create a state that is morally and religiously neutral in its foundations, so that it cannot be shaken by ambitious people on those grounds. For example, the effect of the state of nature teaching is to wipe away the old doctrines of natural rule or natural obligation, original sin, and natural right. All of these high things become the basis of the old moral and religious doctrines that the ambitious could always use to shake up, weaken, overturn the state, which would always be vulnerable to this sort of attack or exploitation of its foundations. So that's why Hobbes leaves no natural basis for any sort of morality or basis for justice, natural law, natural superiority, rank, or rule outside of the sovereign's will. So he gives us a doctrine that is immune to attack, that is tacit consent. But it's for stability, for the sake of order, that Hobbes gives these doctrines of social contract, consent, and equality. It's for the sake of peace, not in order to give people accountability or more participation in government. Hobbes' doctrines are given for the purpose of finding a basis for political power that is immune from any sort of moral or religious attack or challenge by the ambitious. On Hobbes' grounds, only the existing king or sovereign has any claim at all to the tacit consent of the people. No one else can claim this, and it's a morally neutral claim to rule. And tacit consent is irrevocable. So the great advantage of saying that power comes not from God is because it takes away from God and nature this authority that the ambitious can use to manipulate the people and take power, stir up troubles, intrigue, war, and take power for themselves. And likewise, Hobbes teaches that there's no natural morality. So there's no source of morality higher than the sovereign's will. There's no standard of morality or justice outside of the sovereign's will. No standards of right or wrong rooted in God or nature to which we can appeal. So Hobbes just keeps closing off any avenue or track of justification for challenging the government. He adopts an almost nihilistic view of morality, all for the sake of peace, for a moral purpose. There's no longer any ground remaining on which to stand to make the case that government is wrong, immoral, or that laws are unjust or cause disorder in the name of any sort of higher cause, justification, or standard than our sovereign's will. What the law says, that's what is just. So Hobbes puts forth all these liberating doctrines because he wants to liberate people from the ambitious. In other words, in Hobbes' view, the great danger is disorder or civil war and challenging the sovereign's rightful authority, his right to everything, right to do whatever he wants. This constant challenging of the sovereign and the disorder that results from it, all of this takes place not because people aren't obedient enough. On the contrary, as Hobbes sees it, they're far too obedient, way too easily impressed and prone to follow others. Human beings are far too sheep-like and too easily led or fooled by every ambitious person who comes along and wants to use them. So the problem of disorder is caused by misplaced obedience, our gullibility, our susceptibility to flattery and desire to want people to be around who say they care about us and will take care of us, who say they care for us and actually do care for us and will take care of us, and we can let them take, and we can give this difficult job to them of taking care of us because we want to believe this comforting lie that they love us as much as we love ourselves. So the way you strengthen government is by making people less obedient in general, less susceptible to every fancy speech or flattering doctrine, and less prone to following the ambitious, more dismissive of big abstract ideas. Then they'll just fall in line, they'll obey the government because the government's got the gun. Prior to the invention of a morality and a religiously neutral claim to rule, governments had to make such claims for themselves and contend with others who also claimed their authority on the same sort of moral or religious grounds. And this was always biting off more than it could chew for Hobbes, leading to a constant battle to rule and retain, assert legitimacy to rule on all sorts of contestable grounds all the time. Now the fate of people's souls were at stake. The question of who rules touched upon the question of where you would spend your eternal life, in heaven or hell. To anyone who cared about the fate of their soul under these circumstances, civil war was the only option. Hobbes helps ensure peace and stability by removing all these contentious questions and issues from the business of politics and government, and this has helped make government's authority impervious to attack and absolute. Not because people are more obedient in general, it's because they're less liable to follow others on the basis of any ideas that transcend the here and now or the government, and it's simple but absolute in universal principles. So we now think about politics in Hobbes's terms, that is, economically, and according to the morally neutral claim to rule, the secular claim to rule by consent. We should be grateful to him for this freedom that this sort of government has given us, this freedom from the ambitious, and this is Hobbes's legacy to us, a new orientation, a new end or purpose of politics. Now, the puzzling paradox of all these doctrines which were put forth to end all doctrinal warfare, which were intended to strengthen the authority of the state and the king and help better ensure subjects' obedience, the basic effects of these doctrines is liberalizing and liberating. For example, Hobbes's idea that we're all born free and equal by nature, that we have no obligation or duties except for those we give ourselves, and yet he's an absolutist. Hobbes's goal of politics to end human bodily suffering is part of the morality of our times, that is, resisting oppression and avoiding the bad. We're all anti-bad, we're anti-pain, anti-suffering. It's easy to understand his doctrine of scientific geometric politics based on effectively enforced consent or contract as the basis of morality and justice, but at the same time it makes it more difficult to see or understand the purposes of this doctrine. What Hobbes wants to accomplish by promulgating this anti-doctrinal doctrine, our liberation through individualism, that was just a happy accident or a secondary concern of Hobbes, a mere means for his more immediate and more important goal, that is political legitimacy and obedience. So in the Leviathan, Hobbes sweeps away all traditional roles, obligations, duties, morality, etc. to leave us a stripped down, unattached, free individual, isolated and atomized. Now this is a revolution still playing out, going on today. The liberation, the individualization of different groups throughout societies around the world, and something like this is still largely what we mean by social progress in modern society. That is, a society that's more and more individualistic. So this is a liberating doctrine, but that's not why Hobbes made up this stuff. He wants us free, but mostly he wants us free in order that we're obedient to the sovereign, and he leaves the sovereign as the only game in town, the only authority that's left with any basis, any real basis that we can understand and agree on, while every other morality or basis for justice or standards has been dismissed. It does this first by creating a society of individuals. And in a society of individuals, unattached, asocial individuals, the effect, the upshot, is to strengthen the government. Hobbes gives us no reason to be a joiner, no reason to be communal, to hang out and put others above ourselves. You owe no one anything. You should stay free and not give yourself any obligations or commitments. And living under this framework, under this understanding, people become isolated. So it's a divide and conquer strategy. Hobbes' epistemology and his political doctrine leaves people without any means or recourse of resistance against the authority for the powers that be. So it weakens you. It strengthens the power of the central government by liberating you. Its power is due to having no real rivals for our loyalty or obedience. We like to think that the true meaning of this doctrine, for example, the idea that the state is our creation in its legitimacy is through the power of promise and the consent of the people, and the doctrine of representation as being something like accountability, as being sort of a check against absolutism. We think these sort of things are equivalent to democracy, but Hobbes invented these doctrines, and he expressly does not want accountability. He wants absolute, unaccountable monarchy, the very absolutism that we think is the very purpose of the social contract to eliminate. So the purpose of Hobbes' political philosophy was to put an end to political philosophy. That is, there's not going to be any more questions about the whole or a place in it or cosmic foundations or purpose. Now we can turn to political science and just ordering society right on the basis of what we know, and that's on the basis of how we can know things. The genius of the principle of consent is that without claims to moral or religious superiority, it gives us a basis for political superiority. The U.S. is a stable society by and large because it has this Hobbesian root. But in the end, Hobbes didn't simply succeed in expelling political philosophy from politics, because in later generations, they took some of Hobbes' doctrines, like consent, and then they ran with them or abused them or expanded them and turned them into ideologies and doctrines that aimed at more than simply the security of society, and into ideologies that disrupted society, for example, the French Revolution. And Hobbes also wanted to remove high things, the concern for high things, from out of politics. But the resulting politics, the barren politics of the Leviathan state, was just too ugly and too low for people to embrace and get behind. The politics of security absurdity just isn't satisfying enough. It had to be repackaged by later modern philosophers.